I want to welcome everybody for braving the elements, for coming out this morning, and a huge welcome to Miss Lisa Lazarus, the CEO of HISA, for joining us this weekend at Oaklawn.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Oaklawn is really a spectacular place, and it has lived up to all of the expectations.
So first, I want to tell us about your history in racing, because racing has been around for centuries, but you kind of have a new introduction, if you will, to the sport.
Yeah, so my background and expertise is not in racing per se. I came up through a sports regulatory background, focused on anti-doping. I spent a long period of time as the general counsel of the International Equestrian Federation. And probably, the experience that's most relevant to what I'm doing now is back when the Olympics were in Beijing, the International Equestrian Federation, the FEI, had a number of doping positives for horses, and their place in the Olympic program was threatened. And I was hired to sort of come in and restructure the program, sort of bring 133 countries on board under one system. And we were able to do that successfully, sort of reform the whole program, which is working, well to date. And then, after that, I spent a number of years building an equestrian law practice, where I also defended horsemen and sport horses in anti-doping violations and other sort of similar sports regulatory issues.
So in a nutshell, tell us what HISA is, how it came about, because it is fairly new to the thoroughbred world.
For sure. So HISA, first of all, only at this point in time covers thoroughbreds, as I'm sure you know. It's a piece of federal legislation that was passed at the end of 2020, signed into law by President Trump, and essentially it creates one national governing body for horse racing across the U.S., but only in two buckets, which is safety and anti-doping. Now, what the federal law did is it created a private entity, HISA, the authority, which is ultimately responsible for promulgating rules and overseeing safety and anti-doping in horse racing. HISA is not the federal government. We're not, we have to ultimately report to the Federal Trade Commission, but we're a private organization, and I have a very experienced team in horse racing. All of my kind of directors come up through horse racing and really have many years of experience in it.
So on the HISA website, it was part of the 2020 coronavirus stimulus package. The Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act established a board overseen by the Federal Trade Commission that will write rules and penalties aimed at eliminating doping and abuse within the thoroughbred racing industry. So why was it kind of commingled as part of that coronavirus stimulus package?
Well, this is when I can get to evoke the very convenient answer that I was hired in February of 2022. I wasn't part of the writing of the bill or the passing of the bill. Obviously, Congress, acts as Congress wishes. I know that it was a bipartisan, bill, and I know that it had obviously the support of Congress. And the way that I kind of look at my responsibility is this law is there, and it's just my job to make it as effective, as sort of helpful to the industry as possible, as smooth as possible, and that's really what I've been trying to do in the role, is kind of take the law and do the best we can for the industry.
So thoroughbreds are obviously a pari-mutuel wagering sport. Is there a reason why it's only structured for thoroughbreds, not under quarter horse racing, not under standard bred racing? Why are just thoroughbreds? It feels like it's almost, I don't want to use the word targeted, but why just thoroughbreds?
Thank you so much. Again, that was a decision that Congress made, and I presume it was in response to some of the issues that they saw. That being said, though, the Act does address standardbreds and quarter horses, and essentially what it says is that if an organization that represents the majority of either of those breeds wishes to opt in, they can. And also, a state racing commission can decide that they want to opt standardbreds or quarter horses in. So there is a vehicle to cover those as well, but they're not covered currently.
Now, kind of looking back in history in regards to the Federal Trade Commission trying to govern sport, it really hasn't been effective. So they tried to do baseball back in the 70s and 80s. Roger Goodell has not been very vocal, or has been vocal about not wanting the government to get involved with football. What has been the stance from other sports, having now been involved in thoroughbred racing and having done homework now with other sports?
Yeah, so I also spent, the one thing I'd left out of my background is I spent 10 years at the NFL as well as a lawyer, working in various responsibilities there, including anti-doping, and know Roger very well. The issue for, as I understand it, is that the National Football League, they currently have a governing body, that's working. All of these sports, they have, a league office, and they have essentially a vehicle to bring uniformity. I mean, really what HISE is about is trying to bring uniformity and get all of the states sort of on the same page and working collaboratively with state racing commissions and the industry. So I think what I would say to that is there isn't a need in those sports because they have their national governing body. And that's something that I think we want to model ourselves after. The federal legislation is just something that kind of created it, but we're now responsible for running it and for making it as successful as possible.
So I was actually at the beginning of HISA, before it was actually enforced in July, I was one of those that sat on many of the Zoom calls with your staff, telling people, how to register to become a covered person. And there were a lot of questions from horsemen with all of the new regulations that were going to be enforced. And it kind of, we all got the sense that it was rushed. There were a lot of questions, obviously. But if you had to go back and do it all over, obviously with hindsight being 2020, what are some of the things that you would go back and maybe do over?
I mean, listen, I get asked all the time, why couldn't you have delayed it, et cetera. To be honest, like, those questions are above my pay grade. I mean, those are questions and directives that come directly from Congress, right? We had a deadline. We had to launch by that deadline. I think, given the time constraints we were under, we did, the best job that we could. And I actually think, if you look today, we have essentially every single horse and jockey and trainer registered that's running covered horses. It's a very, very small amount of folks that are no longer registered. We've got about 30,000 registered people and more than 40,000 registered horses. I tell people all the time, you register one time. It's not an annual registration. It's not a, it's a one time for life. Once you're in, you're good. And sure, like, there's a lot of things I would love to have the time to do over, but I think we tried to roll it out in a way that was kind of in increments so that the industry could adapt. And now we're really ready to launch the anti-doping program at the end of March.
So tracks and horsemen are making changes to comply with HISA's rules and regulations. How's it been working specifically with Oaklawn? How does Oaklawn stack up with HISA standards?
So honestly and truly, Oaklawn's doing a phenomenal job. I mean, if you look at sort of the violations, things we have very, very few from Oaklawn. There's a very obviously active HCPA here that I think is doing a lot of very good work. We're very lucky to have Ron Moquette, and obviously Lucella is doing a terrific job, and we're constantly in touch. It's great, when there's one racetrack in the state, it also makes it easier, obviously, to work collaboratively. But the truth is that for the racetracks that are already doing really good things around horse welfare, it's not a big change. What we're trying to do is get everyone up to Oaklawn standards, essentially.
Well, that's good to know. One thing we have seen is that it's very expensive to run a organization such as HISA, and costly to operate, and the reported budget, and because it is regulated by the FTC, it is public. Everything is documented, and the reported budget of $72.5 million for 2023, and that is funded solely by the racetracks. Is that accurate?
So it's not exactly. I mean, maybe explain it a little bit. So the way that the budget for HISA works is that we essentially determine what all of the costs would be to run the program nationally, right? And the way that it works is that we need to also sort of keep the money that's already being spent on racing in the system, okay? So the budget, we actually reduced the budget to $66 million because of the later start, but that being said, that's still obviously a huge number. But if you actually calculate the difference between what's currently being spent and that number, it's about a 15% increase, which represents like the delta between what sort of is being spent on safety and integrity and what needs to be spent. It's not solely the racetracks. If the racing commissions opt in to work with us, they have a lot of different tools in the toolbox they can use to raise that money. They could go to obviously different government funds. They can look at ADWs. They can do whatever they want to do. And then if ultimately the responsibility is with the racetracks, then it's typically an agreement between the racetracks and the horsemen. But that's, and we've been, we recognize that this is a big deal and that the money really matters, and we are being, as efficient as we possibly can. And I think that ultimately folks are going to realize that difference, it's really not that significant, and that we're going to be delivering real value for those changes.
Tracks spend a lot of money. NTRA accreditation is very expensive. HISA fees are very expensive. And having talked to multiple racetracks, some of that money comes, and it varies on racetracks, let me stress that. Some of those HISA fees are coming out of the purse structure, which does affect the horsemen directly. Some tracks are paying out of their own pocket for those HISA fees. It's decided upon each individual racetrack how they pay those HISA fees. But sadly, some tracks can't afford those HISA fees. One of those tracks is Fauner Park. And if a lot of you remember, during COVID, one track that really boomed and hit the national stage was Fauner Park. Fortunately, Oaklawn kind of set the standard of being able to keep their doors open during COVID, and we kind of set the standard of being able to continue to race. Fauner Park did as well, and their simulcast just really hit an international mark, and their simulcast did as well. Unfortunately, they're not able to pay their HISA fees, and because they're not able to send out their simulcast signal. So is that really integrity? A lot of people question that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what happened with Fauner Park. So the way that the HISA assessments work is we write first to the Racing Commission, and we explain to the Racing Commission kind of what the costs are. And so we wrote to the Nebraska Racing Commission, and the costs for 2023 for HISA in Nebraska were $261,000. But we said to Nebraska, you're currently spending $250,000. So you just keep doing what you're doing. You keep the same staff, the same people. You do nothing different. We're going to give you full credit for that money, and your bill for all of 2023 is $11,000.
Okay.
Nebraska has an $11,000 bill for HISA for 2023. What happened, though, is that because Nebraska is philosophically opposed to HISA, they said, we don't want to work with you, so we're not going to let Fauner Park have the benefit of the people and the money you've been spending to date. So Fauner Park, you're on your own. So then that full $261,000 bill that was for Nebraska, just to ask them to keep doing what they've always done, went entirely to Fauner Park. So now Fauner Park is sitting without any state support. So we said to Fauner Park, we'll do whatever you want, we'll help you work through it. And they just said, listen, we just don't have the support of our racing commission, and we don't make a lot of money currently from our exporting our signal. They can still import their signal, and that's very valuable to them. So we said we're going to continue talking and hope to work together in the future. But that really, the Fauner Park situation specifically is really not HISA's issue. It's not going to be affordable if racing commissions and racetracks take money that they've been spending all along on these areas and don't let it stay with racing. For HISA to sort of work and be affordable, we need those folks to keep what they've been already doing in the system.
So is that kind of the same situation with the entire state of Texas?
No, Texas is different. So what happened in Texas is that, again, it's a philosophical issue. And so what Texas said is, we don't believe that we can that we can actually implement your rules, because we believe that the Texas Racing Act prevents any other authority from operating in Texas. So Texas told their racetracks that they're not allowed to send out their signal to avoid being under HISA's authority.
So they don't agree with the rules, but that still prohibits them from sending out their signal.
Well,
so is that under FTC?
Yeah, that's under the federal law, and that's under the FTC, and that's because the law is very clear that the federal law preempts state law. There's no other state that's taken the position that Texas has taken. Texas's view is that because the Texas Racing Act says that we're the only authority in Texas that's allowed to essentially run racing, we're not going to let HISA take over the areas that Congress has asked them to take over. Now, every state racing act says that because at the time those laws were written, there was no federal authority. So obviously they were the only authority, and so their law is very similar to every other state racing commission law, but they've just taken this position, and so so in Texas it's not a money issue, it's simply a philosophical issue.
So kind of along those same lines, talking about signals, and let's get into the Fifth Circuit.
Sure.
So HISA's stance is, the overall umbrella is fixing racing, testing. The Fifth Circuit recently ruled in favor of multiple states, tracks, the National HBPA, and the North American Association of Racetrack Veterinarians, finding HISA unconstitutional. Where does that case stand currently?
So I will answer that question, but I just want to start by saying one quick thing, which is that I try really very much to let the lawyers deal with the legal issues.
Absolutely.
And to try to keep myself separate.
Right.
I am a lawyer by training, so I'm not,
But you don't represent HISA.
No, so I
Right.
have a legal team who does that. And
Right.
part of the reason why I do it is because my job is to basically make what we have as good as possible, as collaborative as possible, as effective as possible, and as helpful to horsemen as possible. So I try very much just kind of stay out of all the legal stuff. Until somebody tells me HISA's not operational, I'm just going to keep trying to go and do what I do and make things better. That being said, the current status is that it's been... There's a procedural order in place where there are a number of different, legal briefings and things that are due that I'm told will result in a decision sometime around May.
Okay.
There is an injunction in place in Louisiana and West Virginia, so we're not operational in those two states, but otherwise we're operational everywhere else.
What is that from a personal standpoint? From multiple states, jurisdictions, and I believe, please correct me, if there's also some racing commissions involved, that the National Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association, racing veterinarians that are not for this act. What is that, personally, what does that tell you?
So, well, a couple things. First of all, there are a lot of horsemen's groups that are very much in support. There is also the THA, which is another horsemen's group that is very supportive of HISA and has not been part of the lawsuit and is working with us all the time. Let me also tell you that the National HGPA, first of all, we have Dr. Doug Daniels, who's the president, on our Horsemen's Advisory Group. I speak to him regularly. He's a very good man. He really cares about horsemen. He's working with me to make what we have the best we can be. And for me, if they believe that they need to challenge the law and constitutionality, they should do that.
Right.
They should take it through the steps. Obviously, it's too bad that money is being spent on litigation that could be, I think, helping horsemen and spent in the industry. But everyone has a right to sort of mount their legal challenges. But they're all working very closely with us. I'll also tell you that the main group of veterinarians, the AAEP, is also very much in support of HISA. So there are multiple groups out there. There's a very diverse industry, I think, as we all know. And so we have a lot of support, but we also have those who are challenging us. But, people who ask difficult questions, who want to hold us accountable, we want that. We need that. We need that to be better.
And that is a good thing.
It's a good
Regardless
thing.
of what side you're on,
Correct.
that is a good thing.
100%.
Right. There are several...
But let me just say one thing.
Yes.
I'll be a lot better when everybody likes me.
And you know what?
My kids do sometimes say to me, why is everybody so mean to you on Twitter? Like, it's not
Social
me.
media is brutal. That's why I don't go on it. Now, there are multiple committees under the HISA umbrella. Oaklawn trainers, Donnie Von Himmel and our Ron Moquette, are on the Trainer Advisory Committee. And that is a very good thing that you have gotten involvement from a lot of people in the industry. But what does it take to, what are some of the prerequisites to be on an advisory committee? Because I think some of the things that people in the industry, they say, how did this person get on the committee? Because one of the things when people see a person on a committee, they say, well, how did they get on there? What did they know about horse racing? So how do you decide who is on a committee, Lisa?
So for the Horsemen's Advisory Group, we had hundreds of applications, and we essentially built an internal selection committee where we went through all of those and considered the qualifications. Because the Horsemen's Advisory Group was created to help HISA do better, for that particular group, HISA selected the participants. But you'll see if you look at that group, we did not select people that are just that are just there to tell us we're doing a good job.
No, but
we selected
we
selected a very diverse group and folks who are hard on us and do want to make us accountable. I mean, I think Ron is a great example. He's an incredible representative, I think. He's somebody that I rely on incredibly, almost on a daily basis, because he has a lot of issues with HISA. He's not happy with a lot of things, but he's exactly the person we want because he's willing to talk about it. He's willing to bring the issues to the table.
You do need
and we've made a lot of changes based on things he's recommended because he cares about horses. Here's the thing: we all want the same thing. We want uniformity. We want, kind of our horses to be happy and healthy, and we want integrity. It's just a question of building trust to know that we can get there together, and that's obviously what I'm working on, and we'll sort of see over time if I'm able to build that trust.
What is your stance on Lasix?
So I personally have no stance on Lasix, and HISA itself is agnostic on Lasix. The law itself, the statute, which is something I can't control, does prohibit Lasix once we launch our anti-doping program at the end of March, only in stakes and 2-year-olds. Okay. Otherwise, Lasix are permitted in every other kind of race. We are obligated under the law to create essentially a research group that is going to appoint a research entity to do a scientific, completely objective, comprehensive, transparent study about Lasix. At the end of that study, the results we brought to the industry and brought to the HISA board to make a determination on the future of Lasix. Okay. But that's at least 3 years away.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that HISA has implemented is regulations about jockeys and how many strikes they can give during a race, regardless of the distance of the race. They are allowed 6, and if a rider, this is according to the HISA website, if a rider strikes the horse 1 to 3 times more than the 6 permitted, so 7 to 9 total strikes, then he or she will be fined $250 or 10% of his or her earnings that race, whichever is greater. He'll also be suspended 1 or more days and receive 3 cumulative violation points. So here's my question. If that infraction takes place at Oaklawn, right now they'll lose 1/3 of their work week. So I'm really glad you raised it because that actually is an area we've been doing a lot of work with at the committee, and we do think that the sanctioning scheme is too onerous, and we're making some changes to it. Those will be in effect. Well, we've got to go through the whole FTC process, so they'll likely be in effect towards the end of this year. But we're working very closely with the Guild, and basically what's been proposed is essentially a graded penalty scheme where we take into account
the strength of the purses in that particular region, obviously kind of what the jockey's earnings are, and also making sure that we're not kind of doubly penalizing. That being said, I do think the crop rule itself is working well, and the reason why I say that is that violations are almost at a standstill. You know, like we have very, very few violations now, and we're being told by stewards across the country that it's generally reducing the interference in the stretch, and it's actually had a positive impact on safety, because sort of jockeys are handwriting towards the end. So whether I'm not a jockey. I don't know enough about what it feels like to be on a horse to make any comments on whether that's true or not. But we do watch the data very carefully, and the data does show us that we have very few violations and jockeys are complying.
So in regards to, I went on your website and looked at your team, and you have a very large team. During the beginning of a race meet, when you input, like when trainers come to input horses and that type of thing, is it possible to maybe send one of your staff
100%, yes.
to maybe answer questions, to maybe assist the racing office, maybe the local HBPA? Would that be something moving forward?
So yes, first of all, I don't think I have that large of a team. I think I have like 8 people.
Well, I mean,
over
but no,
the whole
like
country.
on the operations
yes, but
and that
no,
type of thing?
100%, and we've definitely offered that, and we've done it at a lot of racetracks. Oaklawn's done such a good job that we didn't get any SOS
You set the bar too high, Louis.
Exactly. But we do have IT folks especially that go track to track, sit down, and anybody who wants to come in and have anything done for them, they'll do. So we absolutely can do that, and would be happy to do that, actually.
So how many tracks, I mean, because I know you're visiting tracks and, seeing how people do things. How many tracks have you gone to, and what is your favorite racetrack moment so far?
That's a great question.
Excluding Oaklawn, of course.
Well,
I won't put you under the spotlight.
So, for me, I've been to, a number of tracks. Obviously, we're sort of trying to divide up, but I've probably been to about 12 tracks or 13 tracks at this stage. I try to, go when there's something to be done, because obviously there's a lot of work to get done. But in terms of, for me, like what I love the most is I love going really early in the morning and watching the horses breeze when just like sort of it's sunrise. To me, that's when you realize like what it's all about, that it's really all about the horses.
So with HISA being put in place, where do you see the industry in, say, 5 years and then, say, 20 years?
So, listen, it's an incredible industry made up of really good, hardworking people and the horse that everybody loves. And so I see the industry just getting stronger. And I really believe if the industry isn't better because of HISA, we haven't done our job. We're there I say this a lot, but we're really there to help the industry reach its potential. And again, you can disagree about the way that HISA kind of came into fruition, and you can disagree about federal law and all that, and I understand all that. But at the end of the day, we all want uniformity. We all want good rules for our horses, and we all want a level playing field. And if we can just do that together, it doesn't really matter how it happened or what the catalyst was. These are principles and ideals and a mission statement I think we can all get behind. And I think it's going to take some time for HISA to build the kind of trust with the horsemen and groups to believe that that's actually what we want to do, that we want the same things. But I see that partnership growing, and I see that over time we're going to have a stronger sport that leads with principles of integrity and welfare of the horse. And I see a very bright future.
So racing is made up of tradition. Many generations are in the sport. What is one of your favorite traditions in horse racing?
So, wow, what are my favorite traditions in horse racing? That's a really good question. I was thinking yesterday that, and maybe it's a relatively new tradition, but I love the ringing of the bell here at Oaklawn. I love, the traditions that are centered around things like aftercare and caring for the horse. I think I would probably start with that.
Is that something that HISA is going to get involved? Because racing is important, but aftercare is just as important, because thoroughbreds have basically their whole lives left after they get off the racetrack. You know, you're doing all these amazing studies about Lasix and drug reform. Is aftercare going to be something that HISA is going to be involved in?
So yes and no. So the act itself only gives us sort of the authority to make rules from a time that a horse has its first race or its first published work until retirement. But we see aftercare as an incredibly important part of, obviously, the industry itself and our collective responsibility. And so we are working with some of the aftercare organizations. We've got Rick Schosberg on our Horsemen's Advisory Group, who's a big, who works very, does a lot of work in aftercare. And we're looking to have essentially rules and policies that motivate good aftercare rules and good aftercare organizations, and making sure that we can support them, however possible.
Does anybody have any questions? I want to open up the floor for questions for Lisa. I know there's a question. Yes, Lewis.
Lisa, touched on it earlier, but how rigid are the rules? You have a set of rules, you have federal law, you have a mandate, but now you have an advisory committee. You've gotten involved for a couple of months. You have rules that say you have to do one direction, but now you feel like maybe that's not the best way to do it. How can HISA be flexible, or can it be flexible?
Yeah, no, we absolutely can, and there's sort of two ways. One is we're doing an entire revision right now of the racetrack safety rules, and that's something we've been trying to engage with as many horsemen's groups as possible to get feedback. Do you hate the shoe rule? Is the Magna Wave, restriction too restrictive? Do we need to look at Shockwave again? And we've gotten really good feedback, and we have made proposals to modify those rules going forward. But in addition, and those are more like comprehensive, big changes, like a full rewrite. If there's something that we realize that is just like not working, we need to change quickly, we're able to issue guidance, and essentially we have some tools we can use with the FTC to make modifications immediately. So we have both, and we've done that. There have been a number of things that particularly Ron has brought to our attention that we've made changes to that I think are better and represent a more workable, sensible rule. Yeah.
What is the process of a rule change? And when somebody submits something, does it automatically go, is it made a quote-unquote rule? Because, say, for example, Magna Wave was kind of structured in with Shockwave, which, as a Shockwave practitioner, or I'm sorry, as a Magna Wave practitioner, I was floored because they are completely separate things.
Yes, they are. And the rules were different, but unfortunately, you're right. When they were first drafted, they were sort of in the same section. And we did get that feedback, and that is going to be changed. And the way that it works, essentially, is that if we see something that is absolutely clearly needs an immediate change, is just something that we didn't, an unintended consequence, we can issue a guidance document and we get sort of the FTC to approve that process. For a comprehensive review, we get in a lot of emails, we get a lot of feedback, we reach proactively for feedback. We take that all together, we present it to the Racetrack Safety Committee that has essentially the authority to propose rules to the Federal Trade Commission. Then we've got to get the Federal Trade Commission to approve them. But we've gotten pretty good at that process, so we do make it happen. And this has to be evolving. This is something that's never been done before in racing. We had to start from basically a blank piece of paper. So we're going to get some things wrong, but we're going to change them, we're going to listen, and I think that's the important part.
So you do have, obviously, really top veterinarians.
We do.
Did they not go through the list of procedures and know that, say, for example, Magna Wave and Shockwave are two completely separate things?
Yeah, so no, listen, they didn't. And the Magna Wave and Shockwave rules were very different rules. The unfortunate thing was that they were listed together, even though the rules were different. So obviously that's something that wasn't caught, but needs to be changed.
So what was the March 27th?
March 27th is when the anti-doping and medication control program is going to launch nationally.
And all the testing will be funded by HISA? Is
Correct.
So when horses go to the test barn, it's going to be funded by HISA?
Well, that is what the assessments are paying for, amongst other things. So the fees that we talked about earlier, that's what it's paying for, in addition to other things. But that is a big component that's already paid for.
So then the racing commissions will no longer be paying for testing?
So that's how correct. They're not going to be paying for lab analysis. They're not going to be paying for adjudication. And that's the credit that we give them for, like, for example, we hope and expect that in Arkansas, we'll reach a deal with the Racing Commission where the same people will still conduct testing. They'll be still paid by the commission, and the commission will therefore get a credit for those costs against their invoice, which is what I'm saying represents just that the increase is not as significant as the budget might suggest, because it doesn't take into account what's already being spent.
So it will be the same labs, same level of testing?
So the same, for Oaklawn, the same lab, because you use industrial, and that's one of our labs. But essentially, we have fewer labs accredited because the requirements to be accredited are more rigorous than they've been previously. And for me, the biggest game changer in this new program is the fact that all of the labs are going to be testing for the same substances at the same level. For me, one of the biggest sort of challenges to uniformity is when you have labs taking the same sample, but either testing for different substances, or not all the same substances, or calling it at different levels.
Okay.
Then you might get a positive in Arkansas, but then maybe you're okay somewhere else. And that is not good for horsemen. I think horsemen want to know that if they move across state lines, their horses are going to be tested and the results will be consistent across state lines. And so that is, I think, one of the biggest game changers of the new program.
Well, one thing that I know Oaklawn does is out-of-competition testing. Will HISA conduct out-of-competition testing?
A lot of out-of-competition testing. Way more. I mean, to be fair, I don't know off the top of my head what Oaklawn's done, but across the country, way more than has ever been conducted.
And now, will HISA have their own quote-unquote boots on the ground, or will they utilize Oaklawn's boots on the ground? Or I'm just using Oaklawn as an example.
Yeah, so it's going to vary from state to state. It depends on whether or not the Racing Commission and the track want to work with us, but I'm very sort of optimistic about our discussions so far with Oaklawn and the commission, and so there will be the boots on the ground will be the same boots on the ground that you're familiar with, but they're essentially going to be operating under HISA rules and essentially using our system. Like, for example, we're going to have an entirely paperless chain of custody system. So when you come to testing in the test barn, March 27th forward, you're going to look at an iPad. Everything's going to get entered in. The iPad's going to be preloaded with the race card. The test collection officer is just going to kind of tick off which horse it is, etc. You'll be asked to sign on the iPad like you would for like a UPS delivery.
Right.
And you'll get an email right away with kind of with what that means and essentially a receipt. So everything will be transparent, automated, and paperless.
So a very solid chain of custody.
Correct.
So, yes, sir.
Sure.
Will SGF at that 1,000, the drug, the compound, the busted service in the bar, will be other known, now that we know that they exist, will they be on the panel of tests under this?
Correct. Yes, exactly. Correct.
And for every exam or only the slides?
So no, so essentially, well, first of all, so obviously out of competition, we only test for doping substances, not medications, because they're allowed between races, obviously. But essentially, the panels of the top, I'm going to call them 700 substances, there might be something like 1,000 or 2,000 listed, but to be frank, we're not, we're still working towards being completely having the same levels and et cetera for like 2,000 substances, but basically 99% of what's being tested for, all the labs will be testing the same panel at the same level. Yeah. No. Correct. Well, it depends obviously on what's currently happening in your state, because some states are doing a very rigorous job, and so it's not a huge lift. Some states less so, and that's what's going to all get uniform. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Sure. So the way I'll answer that question is that one of the things that our new rules does that I think is consistent with how horsemen view this whole space is that we divide the anti-doping rules into two categories, essentially almost two rule books, okay? One is for banned substances, things that should never be in a horse. So in those categories, I'm not saying, I think people sort of we're not looking at teeny amounts, but if you actually have the presence of some amount of a truly cheating substance in a horse, that will still yield a positive because you should never have it, right? On the other side, the controlled medication, the therapeutics, the testing is at a level that is determined to be performance enhancing, or at least at a level of the scientists, it's above my pay grade, but have determined that there's an impact. And that's why those levels are set at the levels that the labs are agreeing to test at. So when the labs agree to test at something, they're agreeing that that's the level that we all think it's appropriate to call a positive. And that's what they're harmonized around. Yeah. Well, I can promise you that, sorry, based on the town halls I've done in Kentucky, they care a lot about license in Kentucky. So, but no, listen, I think the truth is that we are approaching this study in a truly objective scientific way. We have no opinion now, and we'll talk about the results when we get them. But I understand that it's a very sensitive issue in the industry and how we really need to approach it from a science perspective.
No, she said they're more pro-LASIK.
No, I said they're, yeah, I mean,
in the town halls
I think
that
you were
she's been.
saying that they don't care, they're happy to do away with LASIK. That's not my experience. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Fair. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, okay.
This is trainer Jinx Fires, who is a long-time, very well-respected trainer and member of the Arkansas HBPA. Jinx, you had a question?
I just wanted to bring up the fact that some of the rules that most of them, Oaklawn already had them in place. Number one, we got stewards and racing commission. Got a track committee that meets every other Wednesday. We got 4 outriders. We have cameras in the barn. Every rider has a helmet and vest on. And there's lights and alarms when a horse gets loose. And horses are checked 4 times by different vets before he runs and after. So, you know, I don't know that the government needs to be too worried about what's going on with racing when they got more problems than one-armed paper hanger going on right now.
Yeah.
So I don't see that HISA needs to be here telling us what to do because it's already done.
Yeah. So listen, I fully respect that. I think, you know what I said earlier, that wasn't my call, but you're right. Oaklawn is doing a phenomenal job, and in states and at racetracks that are already doing all these things, you're not gonna, you know, we're just partners. You know, we're just sort of working together, and you're not gonna, I think, in those situations, feel a real difference because you are where we want you to be.
Any other questions? Yes, Joe.
What's your program on racetrack safety and research with regard to racetracks, composition, and this type of thing? You got something
Yeah, so the racetrack safety accreditation program is actually launching next week. I think we're starting with the racetracks in Florida, the accreditation team. We're working with Mick Peterson on the surfaces, and so he's going to be providing to all of the racetracks, which is part of the HISA budget, a surface analysis. And his laboratory is the laboratory that will be conducting that research and that information.
Part two of that question, tracks spend a pretty penny getting accredited by the NTRA.
Mm-hmm.
Will you piggyback off of that? Meaning, will you work with the NTRA, or will you do your own accreditation as part of the HISA fees that tracks already pay?
Yeah, so there won't be any additional fees for our accreditation like the NTRA had.
Right.
If you're already NTRA accredited, you have a 3-year essentially accreditation that HISA recognizes. But after the expiration of that 3-year, HISA will take over the accreditation program, but will not charge additional fees for accreditation.
Anyone else? Yes, Mac. I'm sorry?
Thank you. Right. Yeah, so our rule, I mean, the one thing about having national uniformity and taking it kind of outside of local jurisdictions and courts is that it is truly objective, and there is no favoritism from one track, one commission to another. And in terms of the bettors, you know, we obviously don't regulate the pari-mutuels, but we do believe that having a more transparent rules, more comprehensive rules, a sort of uniform system, that's ultimately good for bettors. And we do have a number of sort of gambling folks that we interact with to get their opinions on rules, et cetera. And that's the feedback they get. They just want to have it the same everywhere. You know, so they want to know if they're handicapping a horse in, you know, one track and it goes somewhere else, so they're looking at the same variables. And that's what we're trying to deliver. Thank you.
So it seems like every time somebody tries to make the sport better, protect the sport, there's a think tank. There's another group that pops up. The TRPB has been trying to, you know, collectively protect racing. The ARCI with the drug protective rules. Are you working with those organizations, or are you over those organizations? Because this is a FTC. This is a government regulated group. How do you work with those other organizations, or do you?
Yeah, no, so we absolutely do, and we do everything that we can to get their feedback, to bring them in. I mean, we look at it as we're one industry. A lot of those groups are sort of voluntary, so some commissions might be a part of it, some might not be, et cetera. So the one thing this does is it sort of says we all have to be in it together. I mean, that's really the difference, right, is that it's no longer a voluntary compact. We got to get this right as an industry, and you know, it's not about, you know, you folks aren't doing it right or et cetera. It's just about everyone needs to be doing it the same, so you know, and uniformity is.
Do you adopt the ARCI model?
So when we built, are you talking about the drug rules?
Yes.
Yeah. So when we developed the anti-doping rules, we looked at we used the ARCI model rules. They're not identical. There are some changes that we made where we thought improvements were appropriate, but we've definitely used a lot of what is already working with the ARCI and incorporated that. We looked at a lot of different sets of rules that we thought were successful and were working well, and we got a lot of feedback on them, and the ARCA was one contributor.
Okay. Any other questions for Lisa? Yes, Ron. Can you speak up just a little, Ron? I know your voice carries. in her time, what would be the largest misconception about our industry? Is that right? Yes.
That's really an easy one, and that is to the extent that there are people out there that think that, you know, there's a lot of cheaters, that trainers or owners don't love horses. That is absolutely 110% incorrect. What I've seen from coast to coast is people who love horses, who care about the industry, who work incredibly hard and would do anything, would do probably more for their horses than they do for their kids, and just want to be able to do what they do and be respected for it. And I think what we're able to do is we're going to be able to showcase that to the world, and we're going to be able to kind of speak up and say, listen, we have uniform rules, we're doing it all the same way, it's a rigorous system, and it's exactly like we've said, which is that we're good people playing by the rules and we care about our horses. And I think that's a message we'll be able to amplify even more once we're, you know, a couple years down the road.
Did you have any idea when you took this job that you were going to be under the microscope every single day like you have been?
You know what? To be honest, I didn't. I took the job because I love horses. I think it's an incredible industry. I think it's a chance to do something impactful, you know, to make a difference. What I didn't anticipate, because I come from like a sort of a long history of sports regulation, is just all the political stuff, you know, that there would be so much, that there would be a fair amount of animosity towards having a federal law. Because for me, it's like, we all agree on the same things, you know. We all want uniformity, we all want good rules for the horses, we all want a level playing field. So let's forget there's a federal law and let's just kind of work together to make it the best version of itself. And that's the part.
Welcome to the club, Lisa.
Happy to be here.
Please give a warm round of applause and a huge thanks of gratitude to Miss Lisa Lazarus. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, too.
Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, first post is 12 noon today.